General Hospital will reveal as the latest revelations from General Hospital began to ripple through the tightly woven tapestry of Port Charles, a collective sense of unease settled over the town like the gathering clouds before a storm. The gray skies above seemed to mirror the growing tension in the lives of its residents, casting long shadows over old secrets and unraveling alliances. Beneath the calm veneer of daily life, fault lines were beginning to crack wide open, exposing long-buried betrayals and igniting the kind of emotional upheaval that Port Charles had long feared was inevitable. Micheal's sudden return to town, after a prolonged period of recovery and soul-searching, sent shockwaves through the community. His presence was not simply a personal homecoming but a catalyst that threatened to unearth every carefully guarded lie and compromise made in his absence. For those who had kept secrets in the dark, his arrival was like a floodlight, fierce and uncompromising. The undercurrents of guilt and fear surged into the open, and few would be spared from their force. Observers of the town's intricate relationships knew that the delicate balance between Drew and Willow was teetering on the edge of collapse. From the outside, their partnership had appeared to hold strong despite the pressures around them. But beneath that facade was a fragile truth. Their union had been stitched together more by desperation than by love, and it was only a matter of time before the threads began to fray. Long before Micheal's return, Drew had quietly orchestrated a strategy to preserve his grip on Willow. When she had sought to reconnect with Micheal during his time in Germany, Drew intervened with calculated precision. He paid off the director of the Baden-Baden clinic to prevent any contact between them, ensuring that Willow would never know the full story. She believed Micheal was intentionally avoiding her. In reality, Drew had pulled the strings from afar, manipulating perceptions, sowing doubt, and reinforcing his place in her life with cold efficiency. But secrets rarely stay buried in Port Charles. The lingering questions about Drew's late-night meetings and the intensifying whispers about his connection with Nina began to grow louder. The pieces started to come together, and Tracy, ever the matriarchal tactician, began threading the connections between the ketamine scandal and Drew's more intimate deceptions. Once incarcerated and silenced, Tracy now had time to think, to remember, and to plan. She knew Drew and Nina had shared more than just casual encounters, and when her moment of liberation arrived, she would unleash every weapon in her arsenal without hesitation. While chaos mounted in town, away from the public eye and removed from the vortex of scandal, Sasha lived through a quieter kind of storm. Nestled within the sprawling Quartermain estate, she faced the final, most harrowing stretch of her pregnancy in near isolation. She was surrounded by wealth, by history, by whispers of old Corinthos and Quartermain legacies, but emotionally, she was utterly alone. Her past traumas, most painfully, the premature birth and death of her first child, Liam, hovered like specters, haunting her with every ache and movement of the new life growing inside her. And yet, despite everything, Sasha held on to hope. Somewhere deep in her heart, she believed that Micheal would come back. Not just as the father of her unborn child but as the man who once held her heart. Their relationship had unraveled under the weight of tragedy and timing, but some bonds don't completely break. They stretch, they fray, they retreat into memory, but in moments of vulnerability, they reignite with surprising intensity. When news broke that Micheal had returned to Port Charles, Sasha's heart leapt. She imagined him walking through the gates of the estate, rushing to her side, whispering apologies for all that had passed, vowing to make amends, not just for the sake of the child, but for the connection they still shared. But what she didn't know was that Michael's return would not unfold as she hoped. It would instead be the moment that sealed her solitude. Just as Sasha's contractions began to intensify and she was being rushed into emergency care, Micheal found himself pulled in another direction entirely. Wiley, his son with Willow, the boy he loved more than anything, had expressed something that would forever change the course of events. The child had cried out for his father, desperate and emotional, confused and deeply hurt by the presence of Drew in the paternal role. Wiley, still too young to understand the complexities of adult relationships, made his preference painfully clear: he wanted Micheal. Not Drew. Not anyone else. Just his real dad. And Micheal, overwhelmed by the weight of those innocent pleas, felt something shift in him. All his internal conflict, the guilt, the regret, the confusion, collapsed into a single, undeniable truth. He had to be there for his son. The timing was cruel, the implications devastating, but Micheal made his choice. As Sasha writhed in pain, surrounded only by nurses and unfamiliar doctors, Micheal was holding Wiley in his arms. Willow, stunned but hopeful, watched as Micheal vowed to rebuild their family. He whispered to her not of romantic promises, but of unity, of healing, of putting Wiley and Amelia first. He would return home, not out of passion, but out of paternal duty. And Willow, tired of fighting, accepted it. She had loved him once. Perhaps they could find a way back to each other, not as lovers, but as parents navigating the ruins of their past. Meanwhile, back in the hospital, Sasha was forced to fight alone. The child was born too early. Fragile. Breathing faint. The doctors moved quickly, transferring the newborn into a temperature-controlled incubator, warning of underdeveloped lungs and a host of possible complications. Sasha heard their words, but they didn't register. Her mind was elsewhere. Her eyes scanned the hallway outside, waiting for the man who never came. Micheal never showed. And in that moment, exhausted, broken, and left behind once more, Sasha stopped hoping. She had nothing left to offer but tears that refused to fall. She had faced death once through the loss of her son and the murder of Brando. Now she faced abandonment, not as a victim, but as a woman hardened by betrayal. Port Charles would eventually learn of her ordeal, but by then, something fundamental within her would have changed. There would be no return to who she once was. Because Sasha had given all she had, her body, her heart, her trust, and in return, she was left with silence and the echo of a door that never opened. Micheal had long understood the emotional gravity that tethered him to Sasha, a connection forged in past loss and silent resilience. As he entered the sterile, dimly lit hospital room where she labored alone, that weight settled heavily in his chest. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and tension, the mechanical hum of fetal monitors underscoring each ragged breath Sasha took. She lay pale and trembling beneath the harsh overhead light, her body clenched in pain, her eyes glassy with the fear that history might repeat itself. Her vulnerability, raw and unguarded, stirred something deep within him. A mix of guilt, tenderness, and a pull toward what could have been. Yet even as he took a step closer to her bedside, the emotional tide turned sharply. A child's cry pierced the corridor, sharp, high-pitched, urgent. It was Wiley. The sound traveled like a beacon through the silence, and with it came the weight of paternal responsibility that Micheal could neither deny nor defer. Wiley, confused and frightened by the changes in his world, had reached for the one constant he understood. His father. The presence of Drew, the strain between Willow and Micheal, the unspoken tensions of a fractured home, had all converged into that single moment of panic from a child who could sense that his world was shifting again. Micheal stood frozen, caught between two worlds. In one room lay Sasha, carrying a piece of him that had not yet taken its first breath. In the hallway stood Wiley, the child he had raised, loved, and promised to protect. The unspoken question hung between past and present: where did his loyalty truly belong? The emotional thread connecting him to Sasha, delicate and fraying, could not withstand the weight of Wiley's cry. It snapped, silently and decisively. Turning from Sasha's side, Micheal moved toward the source of the sound, driven not by cold calculation but by instinct, an unyielding need to reaffirm his presence in his son's life. Each step away from the delivery room was a renunciation of what might have been, a surrender to the path already paved by fatherhood and fractured vows. The corridor stretched long and sterile, but his resolve did not waver. He reached Wiley and knelt without hesitation, anchoring himself once again to the child who needed him most. Elsewhere in the hospital, Willow stood quietly, the weight of recent betrayals still heavy on her shoulders. The unraveling of her relationship with Drew, the revelations about Baden-Baden, and the shattering of trust had left her emotionally numb. Yet as Micheal approached, his posture stooped by unspoken remorse, something shifted within her. She did not expect passion, nor did she seek dramatic redemption. She merely needed clarity, and Micheal's return, quiet and unassuming, offered that. The reunion between them was not marked by grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It was defined instead by stillness, an unspoken agreement that the remnants of their fractured family were worth preserving. Wiley clung to Micheal's side, Amelia's small hand found Willow's, and in that tableau of understated reconciliation, a new family structure emerged, not one bound by flawless love, but by mutual necessity and a shared determination to shield their children from further instability. Meanwhile, back in the dim aftermath of delivery, Sasha lay in recovery, swathed in silence and a thin hospital blanket that offered little comfort against the chill of abandonment. The room smelled of sterile linens and saline, the shadows long and unmoving. Her child, born prematurely and struggling for breath, had been whisked away by a team of neonatologists the moment the delivery concluded. Words had been spoken. Terms like underdeveloped lungs, incubator, and critical period echoed faintly in the background, but Sasha absorbed none of them. Her gaze remained fixed on the ceiling tiles above her, unmoving and unfocused. She had not asked where Micheal had gone. She had not needed to. The absence spoke volumes, and the vacant chair beside her bed confirmed what her heart had already begun to accept. Micheal had made a choice. Not one born of malice or cruelty, but one that carved a permanent void within her nonetheless. He had chosen another life, another family, another definition of love. Tears did not come. There were no sobs, no pleas, no desperate calls for his return. Sasha had no energy left for mourning. Her body was broken, her spirit numb. The last reserves of hope that had carried her through the final weeks of pregnancy, the belief that Michael's return might rewrite her story, had evaporated the moment he walked away. She felt no anger, only resignation. The kind that settles deep and cold and final. In the nursery, machines blinked and beeped in rhythm to a tiny life's fragile pulse. Nurses moved efficiently, adjusting wires, monitoring vitals, unaware of the quiet devastation unfolding just rooms away. They spoke in clinical tones, careful and detached. No one mentioned the mother lying alone, stitched and silent, beyond the door. Sasha remained motionless, not out of physical exhaustion but because movement felt futile. There was nothing left to reach for, no one left to reach toward. The pain she carried was not just physical, it was existential. She had not simply lost a partner or been betrayed by circumstance. She had been erased, quietly and completely, from the narrative of a man who once swore to care for her. Outside, the sky over Port Charles remained a dull, oppressive gray, as if in mourning. The town carried on, unaware that somewhere inside General Hospital, a woman had just survived the unthinkable. Not the birth of a premature child, not the risk of maternal complications, but the realization that no one would come. That no hand would reach for hers in the dark. That survival would be hers alone to manage, with no rescue, no reunion, only resolve. And somewhere deep within the quiet corners of that recovery room, a woman once full of hope became something else entirely. Something colder. Something stronger. Something unbreakable. Jason stood at a distance, half obscured by the shadows of the hospital corridor, watching as the lives of those he once held close splintered before his eyes. He was silent. Not out of apathy, but because the weight of what he knew had long since choked the words from his throat. Once, he had been a central figure in the intricate web of power, loyalty, and protection that defined Port Charles. Now, he was an observer, exiled by circumstance and buried secrets. The rumors that he could be the father of Sasha's child had never been confirmed nor denied, lingering in the air like smoke that never cleared. And yet, in his heart, he had known the truth all along. He watched as Micheal stepped back into the spotlight, not just as a returned son, but as the man who had reclaimed his role in the Corinthos legacy, the man who had chosen stability over complexity, public virtue over private obligation. The entire hospital seemed to hold its breath as news of Sasha's premature delivery spread. Whispers seeped through walls and past closed doors, stories changing with every retelling. But one constant remained. Eyes now followed Micheal wherever he went, not with admiration, but with scrutiny. Jason understood the game had shifted. This was no longer about paternal truth, about Sasha, or even about the newborn fighting for breath in the NICU. It had become about narrative, about who got to be the hero and who would be written off as collateral damage. Micheal had reinserted himself into the Corinthos dynasty with precision. A reunion with Willow, an embrace with Wiley and Amelia, a sudden but carefully framed portrait of redemption, it was enough to win back public favor. But Jason saw what others missed. He saw the vacancy in Michael's eyes when no one was looking. The mechanical smiles, the carefully timed appearances, the quiet moments where guilt crept through the cracks of a meticulously crafted performance. Because Jason also saw Sasha. He saw her retreat into silence, away from the reach of friends and community. The hospital had become her world now, and within that narrow, sanitized space, she lived hour by hour, breath by breath, beside the fragile infant who represented both tragedy and salvation. She no longer answered messages, avoided visitors, and when she moved through the corridors to the NICU, she did so with the weight of abandonment pressing against her every step. There was no longer fire in her expression. Only the dim embers of someone surviving because they had no other choice. The town's whispers did not spare Willow either. The woman once seen as noble and principled was now the subject of murmured judgment. Her decision to welcome Micheal back despite the complexities, despite Sasha, despite the questions of fidelity and timing, became fodder for salon gossip and quiet disdain. Though she walked through the town with her head held high, Willow could feel the shift in energy. Eyes lingered longer. Conversations paused when she entered rooms. Respect had been replaced by curiosity laced with doubt. Still, Willow carried on. She moved forward with Micheal, co-parented with grace, and maintained her composure. But the cracks beneath the surface deepened. Not all wounds leave visible scars, and betrayal rarely fades quickly, even when publicly forgiven. Her nights were restless, her dreams haunted not by the past, but by the sense that none of it. Her marriage, her family, her image, was quite real anymore. And Micheal, for all his efforts to maintain the illusion of normalcy, could not escape the echo of Sasha's eyes. The look she gave him as he turned away from her hospital bed had branded itself into his consciousness, a moment frozen in time that would revisit him in the quiet of every sleepless night. He would lie beside Willow, still and silent, as visions of Sasha's pain unfolded behind closed eyelids. Not just the pain of childbirth, but the deeper, more corrosive pain of knowing she had been abandoned by the one person who had once promised to stand by her. The baby, his baby, remained nameless for days. It lay in the incubator, wrapped in tubes and prayers, while doctors measured oxygen levels and brain activity with guarded optimism. Micheal visited, sometimes in secret, standing behind glass, afraid to enter. Afraid to touch what he had created and then rejected. Each time he left, he told himself he would return the next day, speak to Sasha, hold his child. But each day passed, and he did not. Jason, still watching from the periphery, began to see what others refused to acknowledge. The storm wasn't over. It had barely begun. The air in Port Charles grew heavy, thick with anticipation. Conversations grew sharper, alliances more fragile. The Quartermain estate tightened its gates, the Corinthos compound became a fortress, and the hospital halls were no longer a place of healing, but a battlefield where reputations, relationships, and lives silently unraveled. Something larger loomed just beyond the horizon. The town felt it, an intangible pressure building beneath the surface, the sense that the balance of power was shifting once more. That truth, long suppressed, would soon demand release. A reckoning was coming, slow but inevitable. And this time, there would be no place to hide. No shield strong enough, no alliance safe enough. Not for Micheal. Not for Willow. Not for Drew. Not for Jason. And certainly not for Sasha. Another storm was on its way, merciless, unrelenting, and dangerously overdue. And when it struck, the question would no longer be who was right or who was loved. It would be who remained standing when the dust finally settled.